The laugh came through the speakerphone before I even finished my sentence. A short bark. Male. Amused. "You're resigning?" Richard said. "Maya, come on. After 15 years? Good luck out there." The conference room at Halbrecht Financial Compliance Services was freezing. They kept the executive floor cold enough to preserve meat. I remember because my fingers had gone numb around the manila folder sitting in front of me. Inside that folder were 11 documented compliance violations tied directly to the company's municipal reporting division. 11. I slid the folder across the polished table toward him. Richard didn't even look at it. His nephew did, though. Ethan Caldwell stopped smiling for about half a second. Then Richard leaned back in his chair, adjusted those expensive suspenders he thought made him look distinguished, and said the sentence that ended his career. "None of this matters after Friday anyway." 3 weeks later, federal auditors walked into the building carrying copies of the same documents. By then, Richard wasn't laughing anymore. "My name is Maya Bennett. I was 46 years old when I resigned as Senior Internal Audit Director at Halbrecht Financial Compliance Services in Charlotte, North Carolina. 15 years with the company. I started there in 2011 when we occupied 2 floors above a regional insurance office and processed compliance reviews for community banks across 3 states. By the time I left, we handled regulatory reporting for 78 financial institutions and managed just under $11.4 billion in monitored municipal assets. Most people outside finance hear words like compliance or internal audit and immediately fall asleep mentally. I understand. The work isn't glamorous. But here's what compliance actually means. It's the difference between a bank paying a small fine and losing its federal operating authority. It's the difference between catching reporting fraud early or explaining to regulators why nobody noticed 6 quarters of falsified reserve data. And for 15 years, I was the person who noticed. I built the cross-check escalation framework in 2016 after a reporting discrepancy cost one of our clients $2.3 million in penalties. Cross-check reduced filing errors by 82% in 14 months. In 2019, I redesigned the municipal disclosure review sequence. Average audit turnaround time dropped from 19 days to 6. During COVID, while executives recorded motivational videos from vacation homes, I slept on an air mattress in my office for 4 nights because 2 regional banks were facing emergency liquidity reviews and the reporting deadlines couldn't move. Nobody asked me to do that. I just understood what would happen if we missed the filings. I also built the ARC protocol, Automated Regulatory Continuity, a boring name for a very important system. ARC tracked unresolved compliance exceptions before they reached federal thresholds. In plain English, it stopped executives from forgetting inconvenient violations until regulators discovered them first. ARC saved the company repeatedly, which was probably why certain people eventually started resenting it. My office sat on the 14th floor beside internal risk management. No windows. Gray carpet. The kind of place where people walked quickly while pretending not to panic. I liked it. Quiet systems make money. Loud executives spend it. Most of the people I worked with understood that. Sandra Cho in legal definitely did. Sandra had been with the company almost as long as I had, and she possessed the exhausted facial expression unique to women who routinely cleaned up messes created by confident men. Then there was Daniel Ruiz from operations. Smart. Careful. Never spoke unnecessarily. We survived because we documented everything. Then Ethan Caldwell arrived. 32 years old. Fresh haircut every Monday. Shoes too shiny for someone who claimed to work 80-hour weeks. Richard Caldwell's nephew. Officially hired as Strategic Finance Operations Lead, which meant absolutely nothing. The first time I met him, he walked into a quarterly risk review 20 minutes late carrying a golf bag. Not metaphorically. An actual golf bag. "Sorry," he said, dropping into a chair beside me. "Client networking." Sandra looked at me over her glasses. I wrote 1 sentence in my notebook. Does not know where he is. The meeting concerned Federal Reserve disclosure timing requirements. Fairly serious topic. Ethan interrupted twice in the first 10 minutes. "We should leverage more proactive synergy metrics," he announced. Silence. Daniel blinked slowly. Richard nodded like his nephew had just solved world hunger. I said, "What metrics specifically?" Ethan smiled. "You know, compliance KPIs." "Which ones?" He adjusted his cufflinks. "The important ones." That became a pattern. He used jargon like a teenager borrowing business terms from TikTok clips. He called audit trails receipt algorithms. He referred to federal examiners as government stakeholders. Once, during a review of municipal reserve discrepancies, he confidently announced, "The exposure probability variance is vertically integrated." Sandra nearly choked on her coffee. But Richard adored him. Of course he did. Richard Caldwell had spent 22 years building Halbrecht into a profitable regional compliance firm. I respected that. He was intelligent in the way old corporate survivors often are. But he had one catastrophic weakness. He believed confidence and competence were interchangeable. Ethan understood that perfectly. Within 3 months, Ethan started presenting my findings during executive meetings without crediting me. Not even subtly. One Thursday morning, I walked into conference room B to hear Ethan explaining the ARC escalation structure to senior leadership using slides I had personally built. Same formatting. Same language. He even kept my typo on page 14. "The brilliance of this framework," Ethan said, pointing at the screen, "is that I designed it to create predictive compliance continuity." I sat down quietly. Richard spotted me near the back wall. Didn't say a word. After the meeting, Daniel caught up with me near the elevators. "You gonna say something?" he asked. "No. You built that." "I know." Daniel stared at the closing elevator doors. "He's gonna break something eventually." "Yes," I said. "He is." The first rail warning came 6 months later. Ethan approved a reporting adjustment for North Valley Municipal Credit Union without running secondary verification protocols. Translation? He bypassed mandatory review procedures because he thought they were slowing things down. The adjustment understated reserve exposure by $4.8 million. I caught it 19 hours before submission. 19. When I brought it to Richard privately, he sighed like I was discussing weather. "Maya, you're too rigid sometimes. Federal regulators won't see it that way." Richard leaned back in his office chair. "Ethan is learning leadership. That requires flexibility." "No," I said calmly. "It requires competence." That landed badly. You could feel the temperature shift. After that conversation, I stopped getting invited to strategic planning meetings I'd attended for years. My promotion review disappeared twice. Then 3 times. Each time, Ethan advanced. At one point, he became acting director of financial risk oversight despite asking Sandra during a meeting whether FINRA and FEMA were basically the same department. Sandra stared at him for a full 5 seconds before answering. "No." The room stayed silent after that. People knew. That's the thing about corporate offices. Everyone always knows. They just calculate risk differently. By the start of my 15th year, I understood exactly what was happening. Richard intended to hand operational control to Ethan eventually. And Ethan viewed experienced employees the way insecure people always do. As witnesses. The final promotion decision happened in March. I remember the date because I had spent the previous weekend finishing a 73-page compliance exposure analysis for a client acquisition worth roughly $18 million annually. Richard scheduled the announcement for Monday morning in Executive Conference 1. Glass walls. City skyline. Fake ficus tree in the corner. All the usual theater. Sandra sat beside me flipping through printed agendas she clearly wasn't reading. Daniel avoided eye contact entirely. Richard entered smiling. Ethan followed behind him wearing a navy suit that fit like borrowed furniture. Richard clasped his hands together. After careful consideration, he said, "We're excited to announce Ethan Caldwell as our new Vice President of Internal Financial Oversight." Silence. Not surprise. Just silence. Then Richard added the part meant for me. "Maya will continue serving in her current role where her institutional knowledge remains extremely valuable." Institutional knowledge. Corporate language for you'll keep doing the work without the authority. Ethan smiled across the table. "I know change can feel uncomfortable for some people," he said. "But modern leadership requires adaptive energy." Adaptive energy. Sandra physically closed her eyes. I said nothing, just gathered my notes. That afternoon, Daniel came into my office and shut the door carefully behind him. You okay? Fine. He doesn't even understand half your reporting systems. I know. Daniel hesitated. Then why are you so calm? Because by then, I had already finished documenting everything. See, internal auditors develop habits most executives never notice. We preserve timelines. We retain emails. We cross-reference approvals against policy language. And starting 11 months earlier, after Ethan's second unauthorized override, I began maintaining a private documentation trail of every unresolved compliance deviation tied to executive interference. Not sabotage. Documentation. Important difference. Every violation had timestamps. Approval chains. Policy references. Recorded objections. I kept everything stored inside routine quarterly archival packets nobody bothered reviewing because they assumed I would always be there managing them. That's the irony. The more competent you are, the less people imagine you leaving. In January, federal reporting requirements changed under revised municipal disclosure oversight standards. Most executives ignored the update because the language was dense and unpleasant to read. I read every page. The revision created a mandatory escalation requirement for unresolved compliance discrepancies exceeding certain exposure thresholds, meaning companies were now obligated to disclose patterns regulators previously might not have seen immediately. ARC identified 11 qualifying violations. 11. Most tied directly to overrides Ethan approved. 3 tied to Richard personally instructing departments to streamline unnecessary escalation barriers. I remember that phrase exactly because it appeared in writing. Twice. So while Ethan was celebrating promotions and practicing executive jargon in mirrored office windows, I was preparing the quarterly regulatory filing due the same week as my resignation. Routine filing. Standard process. Nobody reviewed those submissions before they went external because I had handled them flawlessly for over a decade. Richard trusted familiarity more than oversight. That was his second catastrophic weakness. The resignation meeting happened 4 days before submission deadline. Conference room D. Tiny room. No windows. Smelled faintly like burnt coffee and dry erase markers. Richard dialed in remotely from Scottsdale because apparently golf season had started early. Ethan sat across from me tapping a Montblanc pen against the table. Human Resources sent Melissa Grant, who looked like she'd rather be trapped in highway traffic. I handed over the envelope. Melissa opened it first. Oh, she said quietly. Richard's voice crackled through speakerphone. What's this? My resignation. Then came the laugh. Not loud. Worse than loud. Dismissive. You're resigning? Richard said. Maya, come on. After 15 years? Good luck out there. Ethan smirked. Actually smirked. You sure this is the best market to start over at your age? He asked. Melissa stared directly at the table. I looked at Ethan for maybe 3 seconds. Then I slid the compliance folder forward. Quarterly filing documentation, I said. Richard sighed audibly. Leave it with Ethan. Already prepared, I said. See? Richard chuckled. That's professionalism. Appreciate that. He still hadn't opened the folder. None of them had. I stood up. Melissa finally looked at me. There was something apologetic in her expression. Not guilt. Fear. People confuse those two constantly. Richard said, well, best of luck out there. I nodded once. Understood. Then I walked out carrying exactly 1 box. Coffee mug. Frame certification. 2 notebooks. 15 years reduced to 12 pounds of cardboard. The security desk employee downstairs looked confused when I handed over my badge. Maya? You're leaving. Yes. He frowned. That's probably not good. No, I said. Probably not. The filing transmitted Thursday morning at 8:12 a.m. Standard encrypted submission. 11 violations attached. Cross-referenced evidence included. Regulatory acknowledgement returned at 8:19. Then I turned off my company phone permanently. 48 hours later, Daniel called my personal number. I almost didn't answer. When I did, the first thing I heard was chaos in the background. Phones ringing. Someone arguing. Daniel lowered his voice. Maya. Hi, Daniel. What did you file? I leaned back in my kitchen chair. Quarterly disclosures. Long silence. Then, Jesus Christ. What happened? Ethan got blindsided in a federal review call this morning. Regulators asked for supporting documentation on escalation exceptions. I said nothing. Daniel exhaled sharply. He didn't even know the violations existed. That's unfortunate. Maya, they're pulling archived approvals now. Of course they were. ARC preserved everything automatically. Daniel continued, voice tightening. Richard keeps saying there must have been a misunderstanding. And Sandra just walked out of an executive meeting looking like someone died. I glanced out my apartment window toward the parking lot below. Rain. Gray sky. Quiet. 15 years of anticipating consequences creates a certain emotional distance once they finally arrive. What exactly did you submit? Daniel asked carefully. The required disclosures. Another silence. Then he said the sentence that told me the damage was already spreading. The regulators are requesting external audit authorization. There it was. Not panic yet. Procedure. Corporate disasters always begin politely. 2 hours later, Ethan called. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Maya, he said immediately, too fast, voice thin around the edges. Hey, quick question regarding some of the compliance architecture documentation. Compliance architecture. Not a real phrase. I smiled despite myself. What question? There's apparently some confusion involving historical escalation matrices tied to ARC reporting outputs. Translation. He had no idea what regulators were asking for. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. The documentation is in the archive. Right, but some of the contextual framework isn't translating operationally, meaning he couldn't understand it. The procedures are outlined clearly. Pause. Then the first crack in his voice. Could you maybe walk me through it? No. Silence. Not angry silence. Stunned silence. Ethan recovered badly. Look, we're under a lot of pressure right now and Richard feels. I resigned. That's not really the point. It is for me. Another pause. Then he tried arrogance again because insecure men always return to familiar tools. You know, refusing to assist during a regulatory review could reflect poorly on you professionally. I actually laughed once. Quietly. Good luck out there, Ethan. Then I hung up. 3 days later, Sandra called from a private number. I answered immediately. You were right, she said without greeting. In the background, I heard muffled voices and what sounded like copier machines running nonstop. About what? Everything. Sandra sounded exhausted. The external auditors arrived this morning. There it was. The sentence. The one I had expected since January. Sandra lowered her voice further. They started with Ethan's override approvals. And they found 7 additional discrepancies in under 4 hours. I closed my eyes briefly. 7 more. Faster than I expected. Sandra continued. Richard's trying to limit document access. That's a mistake. He already made it. I could hear footsteps moving quickly somewhere near her. Then Sandra said something that made me sit upright for the first time all week. Maya, they asked specifically whether you'd be willing to consult. I looked at the rain sliding down my apartment window. Outside, traffic moved normally. People carrying groceries. Someone walking a dog. Entire lives continuing completely unaware that an executive floor 18 miles away was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own paperwork. What did you tell them? I asked. Sandra was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she said, very carefully, I told them you don't work for Halbrecht anymore. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. By the end of the 2nd week, the crisis had spread beyond compliance. That was inevitable. People think regulatory failures stay contained inside legal departments. They don't. Once regulators start asking questions, every department suddenly discovers religion. Operations freezes approvals. Finance delays distributions. Clients stop returning calls. Executives start using phrases like abundance of caution while quietly updating their resumes. Daniel called me Tuesday night around 9:40. He sounded exhausted. They shut down 3 municipal review pipelines this afternoon. Why? Because nobody can verify which disclosures were overridden manually versus approved through ARC. I leaned against my kitchen counter listening to him shuffle papers. How many filings? 42 pending. That got my attention. 42 frozen municipal filings meant regional banks couldn't finalize quarterly reserve certifications, which meant clients started getting nervous. Nervous clients become angry clients very quickly when federal timelines are involved. Daniel exhaled slowly. And North Valley just suspended their renewal. That's the $18 million contract. He corrected quietly. There it was. The financial damage. First technical, then relational, now revenue. I poured coffee and looked out at the parking garage across the street. The strange thing was how calm I felt. Not happy, not vindicated, just unsurprised. Competence has weight. You don't notice it until it's removed. The next disaster arrived publicly, which, honestly, was predictable once Ethan started trying to manage optics instead of problems. Halbrecht held an emergency client assurance call that Friday morning. 36 institutional clients dialed in. Richard hosted. Ethan led the presentation. Sandra texted me during the meeting. You need to hear this. 5 seconds later, my phone rang. She'd muted herself and set the phone beside her keyboard so I could listen. Corporate disasters sound surprisingly ordinary in real time. Keyboard clicks. Paper shuffling. Somebody coughing. Then Ethan started talking. We've identified a temporary synchronization inconsistency involving historical compliance harmonization metrics. I closed my eyes. Not a real phrase again. One client interrupted immediately. This is about federal escalation violations, correct? Ethan answered too quickly. No. There's been some misunderstanding around legacy procedural integrations. Another voice cut in. Did regulators initiate an external review or not? Silence. You could hear Richard breathing through the speakerphone. Then Ethan made the mistake that ended his credibility permanently. He tried improvising. The audit activity is mostly collaborative in nature. Mostly collaborative. Sandra later told me 3 clients left the call immediately after that sentence. One demanded full records access. Another suspended payments pending review outcomes. Then came the moment everyone remembered afterward. A client executive from Durham Community Banking asked a very simple question. Who previously managed your internal escalation controls? Nobody answered immediately. Because the truthful answer was sitting in her apartment eating almonds and listening quietly through Sandra's muted phone. Finally, Richard spoke. Our former audit director handled those systems. The client asked, why did she leave? Long silence. Then Ethan said, cultural alignment issues. Sandra actually snorted loud enough for someone to hear her through the line. The client responded instantly. So the person who built your compliance infrastructure resigned 3 weeks before regulators arrived. No answer. Call ended 12 minutes early. By Monday morning, the board got involved. Not symbolic involvement either. Actual emergency oversight meetings. Halbrecht's board consisted mostly of older financial executives who normally treated compliance like plumbing. Necessary, invisible, unpleasant to discuss. Now they were personally reviewing escalation reports at 7 a.m. Sandra called me from the parking garage during one of those meetings. I've never seen Richard look scared before. How bad? They brought in outside counsel. That meant liability exposure. Different category entirely. Also, Sandra added carefully, Ethan tried presenting your ARC documentation to the board yesterday. I waited. He couldn't answer basic questions about the override protocols. Of course he couldn't. He'd spent 2 years taking credit for systems he never bothered understanding. Sandra continued. One board member asked why escalation approvals lacked secondary authentication controls. They didn't. I know that. ARC had them. Ethan disabled the requirement 6 months ago because he thought it slowed workflow. There it was. Public incompetence. Not personality. Not office politics. A documented executive decision tied directly to regulatory exposure. The beautiful thing about audit trails is their complete lack of emotion. Timestamps don't care about hierarchy. By Wednesday, federal reviewers had expanded the audit scope across 3 divisions. The estimated exposure climbed past $31 million. Internal morale collapsed with impressive speed. Daniel told me half the operations team was quietly interviewing elsewhere. Melissa from HR resigned entirely. And Sandra. Sandra stopped sounding tired. She sounded angry. They're trying to blame middle management now, she said during our call Thursday night. Who specifically? Everyone who warned them. I laughed once. Small. Sharp. Classic. No, Maya. You don't understand. Richard actually implied your documentation practices created unnecessary scrutiny. That almost impressed me. Imagine setting your own house on fire then blaming smoke detectors for being too observant. What did the board say? I asked. Sandra went quiet briefly. Then, one of them asked why the only person documenting violations thoroughly was the woman they pushed out. There it was again. Competence. Visible only after absence. Friday afternoon, Richard called personally. Not Ethan. Richard. I let it ring 6 times. Maya, he said after I answered. No laugh now. I think we need to have a conversation. I'm listening. We may have underestimated how much institutional complexity you managed. Institutional complexity. Interesting phrase. 3 weeks earlier it had been institutional knowledge. Now it was complexity because the consequences had invoices attached. Richard cleared his throat. We'd like to discuss bringing you back in a consulting capacity. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the glass again. Same weather as the week I resigned. What kind of capacity? We're prepared to be flexible. Translation. They were desperate. I asked the obvious question. Would Ethan still oversee compliance operations? Silence. Then Richard said carefully, he would remain involved strategically. Strategically. Meaning yes. No, I said. Maya, you don't need a consultant, Richard. You need accountability. Another silence. He switched tactics. We're willing to discuss compensation. It's not a compensation issue. What is it then? I thought about that for a second. Then answered honestly. You still think this happened because the wrong person left. He didn't call again that night. By the 4th week, the crisis stopped being internal. Trade publications started reporting on the Federal Review. Nothing dramatic. Just small, ugly headlines. Regional compliance failures trigger expanded oversight. Municipal review firm faces disclosure questions. Those headlines cost Halbrecht more than fines ever could. Reputation damage spreads quietly. Banks stopped signing renewals. Prospective clients vanished. One regional healthcare credit union suspended a pending $12.7 million partnership entirely. Daniel told me the executive floor felt like a funeral home with better lighting. Then came the breaking point. Monday morning, 8:13 a.m. Sandra called. I answered immediately because she never called before coffee unless something catastrophic had happened. It got worse. How? The regulators found duplicate approval certifications. I sat upright. Duplicate certifications meant filings had been submitted under improperly reused executive authorizations. That crossed from procedural failure into possible federal misconduct. Who approved them? Silence. Then Sandra answered carefully. Ethan. Of course. Not maliciously either. That was the terrifying part. He'd done it because he fundamentally didn't understand the controls he'd overridden. Sandra lowered her voice. The board called an emergency vote last night. Ethan's on administrative leave effective immediately. There it was. The fall. Not explosive. Just administrative. Which somehow felt more humiliating. What about Richard? Still technically CFO. Technically. They stripped his override authority. I stood slowly and walked toward the window. Down below, commuters moved through crosswalks carrying coffees and briefcases, completely unaware that a man who once laughed at my resignation had just lost authority over the company he'd spent 20 years building. Sandra spoke again. Maya, they're asking if you'll meet. This time, I didn't say no. The meeting happened Wednesday afternoon in Executive Conference 1. Same room as the promotion announcement. Same skyline. Same fake ficus tree. Different energy entirely. Richard looked older. Actually older. Not dramatically. Just diminished around the eyes. Sandra sat near the end of the table beside Daniel. Neither of them tried hiding their relief when I walked in. Ethan wasn't there. Board decision apparently. One board member joined remotely through the screen mounted on the wall. Nobody offered small talk. Richard folded his hands carefully. Maya, he began, we need your help stabilizing the company. Direct. Finally. I sat down across from him. What exactly are you asking for? The board member answered this time. We want you to return as Chief Compliance and Risk Officer. Not consultant. Executive authority. Good start. Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside was the proposed compensation package. Base salary, $410,000. Performance equity. Retention bonus. Almost triple my previous compensation. I closed the folder calmly. Not enough. Richard blinked. The board member leaned forward on screen. What additional compensation are you requesting? None. That confused them briefly. Then I clarified. I said the offer wasn't enough. Not the salary. Silence settled across the room. I looked at Richard directly. Here are my conditions. Sandra actually reached for a pen before I finished the sentence. First, I want full executive authority over compliance, audit, and regulatory operations. No overrides without written board approval. The board member nodded immediately. Done. Second, Daniel Ruiz becomes Director of Operational Controls effective immediately with a 30% salary increase. Daniel stared at me. Richard opened his mouth slightly. Closed it again. Third, Sandra Cho becomes Senior Legal Risk Counsel with independent escalation authority. Sandra removed her glasses slowly. Nobody objected. Fourth, every employee terminated or penalized for raising compliance concerns receives formal written acknowledgement, clearing their record. Richard shifted uncomfortably. I continued anyway. Fifth, ARC becomes mandatory infrastructure across all divisions with immutable audit preservation. Nobody disables controls without documented board review. The board member nodded again. Agreed. Then I gave them the condition Richard hated. And finally, I want a formal internal accountability report documenting exactly how these failures occurred, including executive override decisions and ignored warnings. There it was. Richard leaned back immediately. That's unnecessary. No, I said calmly. It's the only necessary part. Maya, public documentation creates liability. I held his gaze. The liability already exists. Richard rubbed both hands over his face. We can move forward without assigning blame. I almost smiled. That's what executives say when blame finally reaches their office door. No report, I said, no return. Silence. Long enough for the HVAC system to become audible again. Finally, the board member spoke. Richard. He didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly. Fine. Just like that. 15 years of being ignored ended with one exhausted word. The contracts arrived 48 hours later. Every condition included. Signed. Verified. Board approved. I returned Monday morning. Same security desk downstairs. Same guard. This time when he saw me, he actually laughed. Oh, thank God. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The elevator ride to 14 felt strangely familiar. Not triumphant. Just settled. Like a building correcting its balance after leaning too far in the wrong direction. When the doors opened, people actually stopped walking. You could feel it immediately. Relief. Daniel approached first. Director of Operational Controls, he said. Has a nice ring to it. You earned it. Sandra hugged me once. Quick. Efficient. Very Sandra. Then she muttered quietly, Richard looks like he aged 10 years. Probably stressful. I walked past conference room D on the way to my office. The tiny freezing room where Richard laughed during my resignation. Door was open now. Empty. Funny how different rooms feel once power changes hands. My old office had been untouched mostly because nobody understood half the systems inside it. Sticky notes still attached to the monitor. Audit binders exactly where I left them. Someone had watered the plant though. That surprised me. At 9 a.m. sharp, I held the first executive restructuring meeting. Richard attended silently. No suspenders this time. I outlined the recovery plan in 12 minutes. Reinstate ARC protections. Rebuild escalation pathways. Restore client confidence through transparent reporting. Independent quarterly reviews. Mandatory executive compliance certification. Nobody interrupted me once. Not even Richard. Especially not Richard. And for the first time in years, I wasn't asking permission to protect the company. I was authorized to do it. 6 months later, Halbrecht looked completely different. Stronger, honestly. Painfully stronger. The total financial damage from the crisis ended around $43.6 million between lost contracts, penalties, legal remediation, and restructuring costs. Expensive lesson, but survivable. Under the new compliance framework, regulatory review scores reached the highest levels in company history. Client retention stabilized. 3 former clients returned after transparency reports were published publicly. Daniel rebuilt operations from the ground up. Calmly. Methodically. Sandra became the most feared legal authority in the building, which suited her perfectly. People stopped bypassing procedures once they realized procedures now had names and signatures attached. And Richard. Richard remained CFO. Technically. But he no longer controlled compliance decisions. No more override authority. No more informal approvals. No more nephew-driven leadership experiments. He became quieter after that. More careful. Honestly, more effective. Humility improved him. As for Ethan, administrative leave became reassignment. No dramatic firing. No public humiliation. Just removal from technical oversight permanently. Last I heard, he handled vendor coordination projects in a satellite office in Atlanta where the phrase compliance harmonization metrics could no longer hurt innocent people. We spoke exactly once after I returned. Brief hallway conversation. He looked uncomfortable. Smaller somehow. I didn't realize how much you handled, he said quietly. I know. That was the whole conversation. And somehow it was enough. Personally, life got better too. I stopped sleeping with my phone beside the bed. Started taking weekends seriously. Bought a small lake house 40 minutes outside Charlotte where nobody says words like synergy unless they're joking intentionally. Some Friday evenings, Sandra, Daniel, and I sit on the back deck drinking wine while mocking old executive meeting jargon. Therapeutic, honestly. A few months after the restructuring, I walked past Executive Conference 1 after another successful federal review. Same skyline. Same fake ficus tree. Different room entirely. The board chair stopped me near the hallway. You know, he said, Richard told us losing you was manageable. I looked through the glass wall into the conference room. Then back at him. Most expensive assumption he ever made. The strange part is I never wanted revenge. Not really. I wanted competence to matter again. That's all. People think power comes from titles or confidence or who gets invited onto golf trips with executives. Sometimes it does. Temporarily. But real power inside companies comes from being the person who quietly understands how everything actually works. The person who documents carefully. The person who notices patterns. The person who prepares before anyone else realizes preparation matters. I still remember that freezing conference room from the day I resigned. Richard laughing through the speakerphone. Ethan asking if this was really the best market to start over at my age. At the time, they thought experience was replaceable because they confused visibility with value. A lot of companies make that mistake. Usually right before the auditors arrive. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the people laughing at your exit rarely understand what held the building together in the first place.